The man walked into the jewelry store just before noon, wearing faded jeans and an old brown jacket that had seen too many winters. His boots were scuffed, the soles beginning to peel at the edges, and the baseball cap on his head shadowed most of his face. He paused at the entrance, took a look around at the glossy glass counters and twinkling diamonds, then stepped in slowly, quietly, like someone entering a room they didn't believe they belonged in. Behind the counters, two saleswomen glanced up at him. One nudged the other with her elbow and raised an eyebrow. The taller one, with a sharp bob and red lipstick too bright for the soft lighting, tilted her chin up and said loudly, "Can I help you with something, sir?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, wrapped in a smile that never touched her eyes. The man nodded. "Yeah, I was wondering if I could take a look at that necklace there." He pointed toward a sleek platinum piece resting under a spotlight, glittering like frost. The second saleswoman snorted, and covered her mouth. "You want to see the platinum set? That's 23 grand, she said, as though that number might physically knock him off his feet. "Maybe you'd prefer something in the clearance case instead?" He didn't flinch. He just blinked once slowly. "No," he replied, his voice calm. "That one." The first woman, still smiling in that frozen way, leaned forward on the glass. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't remove items from the case unless there's a verified payment method ready. Store policy." Her eyes flicked down to his boots. "You understand." He stood there for a second longer, and then gave a small nod. "Sure, that's fair." Then he turned and walked out the door, as quiet as he had come. The two saleswomen burst in a laughter the moment the door shut behind him. The taller one wiped a fake tear from her eye. "That one made my whole week," she giggled. "Did you see those boots? And that smell? I thought he wandered in from the parking lot. Thought he was looking for the food court," the other added. Poor guy must have thought this was a pawn shop. Neither of them noticed the mall security guard standing just around the corner, watching them with a puzzled expression. And neither of them saw the man, now back outside in the sunlight, walk calmly across the parking lot, reach into his coat, and pull out his phone. His voice when he spoke was soft, clipped, efficient. "Yeah," he said. "Go ahead and schedule the signing for tomorrow morning. And get the attorney ready. We're moving forward with the full purchase. Tell them the new owner wants to be on site by Thursday." Then he hung up, slid the phone back into his coat pocket, and walked down the lot without looking back. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we bring you real stories that reveal quiet dignity, everyday injustice, and the strength it takes to rise beyond. If this story moves you, if you believe in second chances and unexpected justice, we invite you to subscribe and join us. Your support gives us the light to keep going. That afternoon, a storm was rolling in over the hills, casting long gray shadows across the concrete walkways of the town center mall. Inside the jewelry store, the laughter had faded, but the mockery lingered like cheap perfume. The two women chatted about weekend plans, oblivious to the subtle shift beginning to stir around them. They didn't know the man's name. They didn't know he had once been a combat medic overseas, or that he came back to a country that barely remembered his name. They didn't know that after 2 decades of working odd jobs and building connections in silence, he had quietly launched his own logistics firm, one that just landed a contract with the Department of Defense worth more than both their salaries combined, multiplied by 100. They didn't know he owned the entire strip 3 blocks down, or that this mall, the one they worked in, had been quietly hemorrhaging losses for years. They didn't know the investment group who held the deed was desperate to offload it to someone with capital, and the only reason the sale hadn't gone through yet was because he was giving them time. Time to prepare. Time to say goodbye. They just saw a man with worn jeans and calloused hands. They just saw the surface, and that's how it always begins. His name was Elijah Moore. Born in a small town in Georgia, son of a mechanic and a nurse, Elijah learned early that clothes never made the man. Character did. But character didn't pay rent. And when his father died in a car accident and his mother worked 2 shifts to keep food on the table, Elijah left high school to pick up work. He did roofing, car washes, fixed engines in the dark. But he never complained. He just worked. Later, he joined the army, served with honor, came back with scars no one saw. Then he started again, this time hauling freight, driving nights across state lines. listening to audiobooks about real estate and investment law while eating gas station sandwiches and sleeping in the cab. Every dollar he saved, he invested. Slowly, quietly. He watched people build and fall, watched businesses collapse. He learned. He read more. By the time he was 39, he owned his first commercial property. By 45, he owned 5. By 52, he owned the holding company that was now poised to buy this mall, that he had walked into that jewelry store not to test them, not to set a trap. He had walked in because he remembered his late wife once loved platinum. Her favorite necklace was platinum, and today would have been her birthday. He had planned to quietly buy the piece as a way to remember her. No photos, no fanfare, just a simple tribute. But instead, he walked out with a lesson. And that night, as the mall closed and lights dimmed, Elijah sat at his desk reviewing the final documents. He could have canceled the deal, could have let the humiliation swallow him. But that wasn't who he was. Humiliation didn't weaken him. It clarified him. He didn't need revenge. He needed peace. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, at precisely 10 a.m., Elijah arrived at the real estate office in a tailored navy suit. His lawyer was already waiting, a folder of documents in hand. The receptionist gave him a double take when he stepped in, confused at first, then nodded quickly when she saw the appointment that an hour later, it was done. The mall belonged to him, and though he didn't ask for an announcement or ribbon-cutting ceremony, word traveled fast. By lunchtime, the regional manager of the jewelry store had received a memo. The mall had a new owner, and the owner had requested a meeting, not with her, with the employees. The two saleswomen looked up in confusion when they saw a familiar man step through the door, only this time dressed in a crisp suit, flanked by 2 other men in business attire. No cap, no boots, just calm, steady steps. Elijah didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He simply introduced himself as the new owner of the property. Then he paused, looked at each of them. "You may not remember me," he said, "but I was in here yesterday." Their faces drained. The taller one dropped the pen she was holding. "I came in to make a purchase. I didn't get the chance." Silence. He smiled, not coldly, not triumphantly, but like someone finally exhaling. "That's all right. I just wanted to stop in today and thank you. Because yesterday reminded me of something important. Never forget where you came from. And never assume you know where someone's going." Then he nodded once and turned to leave. The door closed behind him with a quiet chime. They never saw him again, but they would remember that moment for the rest of their lives. And the man who once walked into their store in worn jeans? He just bought the entire building, and he did it without raising his voice. Of course, below is part 2 of the story titled, "He was laughed out of the jewelry store, but came back with the deed to the mall." Written in a seamless, emotionally cinematic tone, with no breaks, subheadings, or summaries. Just a deeply human continuation. After the door shut behind him, Elijah didn't turn back. He didn't wait for apologies that would come too late or explanations that would feel forced. He simply walked to the edge of the polished corridor, glanced once at the skylight above, and stepped into the quiet hum of the mall. It was still early. The foot traffic hadn't picked up yet. A janitor pushed a mop near the escalators. A teenage couple shared a coffee by the fountain, giggling. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. But everything had. He passed by a storefront that used to be a bookstore, now shuttered, papered up. He remembered buying his daughter's first book there. She was 10. It was her birthday. He had worked overtime for weeks just to afford that hardcover fantasy she wanted. She read it in 3 days. She grew up, moved across the country. They didn't speak often anymore. Not because they had fallen out, but because the years had created distance, the kind that wasn't measured in miles. He missed her every day, and maybe, just maybe, this mall was his way of building something again. Something lasting. The jewelry store was already whispering. Word moved fast, especially when it came to shame. The 2 saleswomen hadn't returned from their extended break. One was apparently crying in the restroom. The other had texted a friend, swearing she was just doing her job, that she had no idea. But it didn't matter. The moment had passed. The lesson had landed. But for Elijah, the day wasn't done. He headed down to the management office. The mall's leasing director, a man named David, met him with a handshake that was too firm and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had been part of the old regime, the ones who saw Elijah's name on the paperwork and assumed he was just a front man, a silent investor, someone to fill in the blank. "You're the owner?" David had said when they met last week. Elijah had simply nodded. "I am." Today, David's tone was far more respectful. He offered coffee, complimented Elijah's watch, said the word "sir" too many times. Elijah didn't mind. He'd learned that some people only respected you when you could sign their paycheck. They walked through the service corridor, clipboard in hand, reviewing vacant units, discussing renovations, potential new tenants. Elijah took his time. He asked about the mall's elderly security guard, about the teen workers in the food court, about the shop owner who was 2 months behind on rent. He wasn't just buying square footage. He was inheriting lives. He treated that responsibility like sacred ground. Later that afternoon, he stepped into a small shop tucked near the edge of the plaza. It sold handmade soaps and herbal lotions. The owner, a middle-aged Latina woman named Teresa, looked up with wary eyes. She recognized him, vaguely, maybe from the real estate articles or rumors swirling around the staff. "Are you?" she asked, folded her hands in front of her apron. "I am," Elijah said gently. She lowered her eyes. "They said you were coming. Look, I know I'm behind on rent. Business has been bad since the shutdown, and my son, he got sick, and..." He raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm not here to collect," he said. "I'm here to ask what you need." She blinked. "I want this mall to be more than leases and invoices. I want it to be a place people trust. And I think that starts with treating its tenants like partners, not numbers." Teresa said nothing for a moment. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she nodded. "We need better lighting. People walk past because it looks too dark in the evening. And maybe a banner for the local businesses. The chain stores get all the traffic." He nodded, writing it down. "We'll fix the lighting. And I'll talk to marketing about a community spotlight program." She reached over, picked up a small wrapped bar of soap, and pressed it into his hand. "This one smells like cedar wood and rain," she whispered. "It's for your wife." He paused, looked down at the soap, said nothing. "She's not with us anymore, is she?" Teresa asked, her voice soft. "No," Elijah answered. "She passed 5 years ago." Teresa nodded, like she understood something deeper. "Then this is for you, to remember her by." Outside, the rain had started. Thin, steady. Elijah walked back to his car under a quiet sky, the scent of cedarwood faint through the wrapping paper in his pocket. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. That night, back at his apartment, he cooked dinner in silence. Grilled fish, rice, vegetables. He ate alone, as he had for many years. No TV, no noise, just the soft clink of silverware and the hum of a life lived quietly. He remembered how she used to hum while she cooked, how she danced barefoot in the kitchen, her wedding ring glinting in the light. He still kept that ring in a drawer, wrapped in cloth. Some memories were too tender to put on display. The next morning, he dressed in jeans again. A hoodie, a ball cap. No one gave him a second glance as he walked the mall before opening hours. He liked it that way, blending in, watching. Near the food court, he saw a group of teens gathered around an old man. It was the janitor. His name was Mr. Lionel. He had worked the floors for 23 years. The teens were laughing, not with him but at him, one on the phone, filming. The old man was trying to mop, but they kept stepping in front of him, blocking his path, pretending to trip and fall for the camera. Elijah approached slowly. Quietly, "Hey," he said. They all turned. The tallest boy, maybe 17, puffed up his chest. "You a cop or something?" Elijah just looked at him. "No, but I'm the man who signs your mall access permits." The boys faltered. "You know who this man is?" Elijah said, nodding toward Mr. Lionel. "He's the reason this food court didn't flood last winter. He unclogged the drainage system by hand in the rain. You kids were home playing video games. He was here, making sure this place stayed open." The boys mumbled, tried to laugh it off, and slipped away. Mr. Lionel gave a small chuckle. "Thank you, sir. Not many stand up like that." "You stood up for this mall for 2 decades, Elijah replied. "It's time someone stood for you." Later that week, Elijah met with the board. He proposed a renovation budget, new policies, tenant protections. But more importantly, he proposed dignity. Respect. Not everyone liked it. Some investors pulled out. Said it was bad business to get emotional over commercial property. Elijah let them go, because this wasn't just business to him, that IT was legacy. And slowly, word began to spread. Not about the sale, not about the new contracts or leasing terms, but about something harder to define. The janitor who suddenly got a dental plan. The single mother who now had a booth at the Saturday market in the atrium. The security guard who was promoted. The jewelry store. Well, they had a new manager now, and a fresh round of training on customer service. But Elijah? He stayed in the background, that he still wore jeans most days. Still walked the halls with a coffee in hand and a quiet presence. People began to nod to him, not because of the suit, but because of the way he listened. One afternoon, he passed by a group of middle schoolers visiting on a field trip. One of them, small, bright-eyed, maybe 12, ran up to him. "Mister, are you the man who owns the mall?" Elijah paused, smiled. "I guess you could say that." The boy beamed. "My mom says you helped her get a job. She says you're a good man." Elijah knelt to the boy's level. "Tell your mom she helped herself. I just opened a door." The boy nodded, serious as a soldier. Elijah stood again, walked on, and in that moment the man once laughed out of the jewelry store was no longer invisible. He was a presence, a quiet force, and yet he still moved like the wind, seen but not loud. Felt but never boastful, because real power doesn't need a shout. The weeks passed quietly, but something in Elijah began to shift. Not on the surface. On the surface, he still moved the same way, still answered emails with brief, direct replies, still preferred sitting alone in the corner of the cafe over any boardroom luncheon. But inside, there was a pressure building, a weight he hadn't allowed himself to name. At night, he found himself staring at old photographs longer than usual. The one of his daughter in cap and gown. The one of his wife beside him at the lake, holding up a fish too small to matter, but smiling like it was gold. The mall was doing better. The changes he had proposed were slowly becoming visible. New plants lined the walkways. Shop owners said hello with warmth now, not fear. And the cleaning staff, people who used to be invisible, were being called by name. But with each improvement came more attention. News crews called. Local reporters asked for interviews. One woman even showed up outside his car with a camera and mic, wanting to hear his inspirational story. He shook his head, told her there was no story. Just work, just responsibility. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There was a story. It just hadn't finished unfolding yet. And then the letter came, folded neatly. No return address. Postmarked from Georgia. The handwriting was familiar, so familiar, it made his chest tighten. It was his daughter, after years of silence. She wrote that she'd heard about him, that the news was circling even across state lines, that people were telling stories about a quiet man who bought the mall just to remind people how to treat one another. And she had a question, a single question. "Is that you, Dad?" He didn't answer right away. He sat with the letter on the kitchen table for 2 nights before writing back. He told her yes, it was him, and that he wasn't trying to make headlines. He was just trying to make something right for himself and for people like her mother. He ended the letter with one sentence. "If you ever want to see where I've been hiding all these years, this place is yours too." He didn't know if she'd come. The following day started like any other. Rain tapping the roof of the atrium. A slow current of footsteps in the walkways. But by mid-morning, something changed. Elijah received a call. One of the mall's tenants, a watch repairman named Arthur, was being evicted from his home. A bank error had cost him his last 2 payments. The sheriff was on the way. Elijah dropped everything. By the time he got to Arthur's apartment, the rain was pouring hard. Arthur was sitting on the steps, holding a cardboard box with photos sticking out the top. His hands were shaking. "I didn't know who else to call," he said quietly. "I thought maybe you could make a call. Talk to someone." Elijah didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone. Within 15 minutes, a lawyer was on the line. A man Elijah had helped put through law school. A man whose mother once cleaned floors for a living. The eviction was halted. The bank reversed the freeze. Arthur's hands kept trembling, even after the news came through. "I was this close," he said, holding his fingers an inch apart. this close to losing everything. Elijah looked at him, voice steady. No, you weren't. Because you're not alone anymore. He didn't stay for thanks. He just got in his car and drove back to the mall. But the drive home wasn't quiet this time. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, the ache in his chest heavier. It wasn't about Arthur. It wasn't about the store. It was something deeper. That night, as the mall lights dimmed and the last few patrons drifted out, Elijah walked alone past the jewelry store. The new manager was sweeping behind the counter. She looked up and gave him a nod, but he didn't stop. He turned toward the fountain in the center of the mall. The water shimmered beneath the skylight. It was the same fountain where he and his wife had once sat on their anniversary, long before he ever thought he'd own this place. He remembered how she dipped her fingers into the water, laughed at how cold it was, and whispered, "One day, you'll own more than you think. Just promise me you'll use it well." She was gone now, but the memory burned like a lamp on the darkest night that he sat on the edge of the fountain, reached into his coat, pulled out the small bar of soap Teresa had given him, the one that smelled of cedarwood and rain. He held it up to his nose, breathed in, closed his eyes. Then the storm came. Tea didn't come from the sky. It came in the form of a phone call. One of the leasing agents had made a mistake, a costly one, signed off on a tenant contract without reviewing the fine print. A large corporate chain was using it to attempt a buyout of 3 adjacent stores, pushing out local businesses. If it went through, half of the community shops would be gone within months. Elijah froze. This was the very thing he had built his life trying to protect others from. Quiet exploitation, legal traps, fine print used as weapons that he spent the night reading the contract by lamplight, redlining pages, calling legal contacts, researching precedent. At 3 a.m., his eyes blurred with fatigue, he sent out a statement to his board. If they want to fight, they'll get one. But not on my watch. The next day, he called a town hall meeting in the central atrium. Shop owners, employees, even the janitorial staff came. Elijah stood at the center in his old brown jacket and worn boots. Not because he didn't have suits, but because he needed them to remember something. "I'm not here because I bought this place," he said. "I'm here because I remember what it felt like to be ignored, to be told you don't belong, that you don't look the part. And I swore if I ever got the chance, I'd build something different." He held up the contract. "They tried to slip this in behind our backs, to take what we built. But I promise you, I'm not signing. Not now. Not ever." A quiet cheer rippled through the room. Someone clapped. Then someone else. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Later, as people filtered out, a young woman approached. She was tall, with Elijah's eyes. She didn't say her name. She didn't have to. He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "You came," he said. She nodded. "I wanted to see it for myself." And she looked around. "You built something real, Dad." He swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "You want a tour?" he asked. She smiled. "I'd like that." They walked the halls together, past the bookstore, the soap shop, the food court, and finally, past the jewelry store. This time, Elijah stopped as he walked inside. The manager looked up. He pointed to the same necklace, the one they'd refused to show him weeks before. "I'll take that one," he said. The manager nodded. "Would you like a gift wrap?" "No," Elijah said, taking the box in his hand. "It's for someone who didn't need wrapping to shine." Then he turned to his daughter, held it out. "For your mother," he said softly. "From both of us." She took the box, said nothing, but her eyes said everything. And in that moment, the mall wasn't just a building. It was a second chance, a monument to the quiet, to the overlooked, to the ones who carried dignity like armor. The man who once left this store in silence now stood here as its landlord. But more than that, he stood as a father rediscovered. And outside, the storm finally broke, washing the city in light. Of course, below is part 4, rewritten exactly to your specifications. Written continuously, with no line breaks, no headings, no hyphens, and in the same emotional, cinematic tone and storytelling flow. The morning sunlight crept through the tall skylights of the mall, casting long soft beams onto the marble tiles as if even the day itself were pausing to notice something had changed. And it had. The man once invisible in this place now walked through it not with pride, but with purpose. Elijah's footsteps echoed gently as he made his usual rounds. But this time, there was someone walking beside him, his daughter, Maya. It had been more than 3 years since they'd spoken face to face. The last conversation had ended with silence, a silence born not of anger, but of grief neither of them knew how to hold. She had left for school on the West Coast, and Elijah, still raw from losing her mother, hadn't known how to say "I miss you" without breaking. So he didn't. And in the years that followed, letters went unsent, calls went unanswered, birthdays passed with cards never mailed. Until now, she had arrived the day before, standing quietly in the back of the town hall gathering, her eyes fixed not on the contract, not on the crowd, but on the man holding the paper. The man she remembered as strong but distant. The man who never cried at the funeral, who didn't hug her goodbye when she left. The man who now stood up to protect strangers with more fire than he ever used for himself. Elijah had offered her a tour, and they walked slowly past storefronts he had saved and names he remembered. She listened, asked questions, laughed once when he told her the cinnamon roll shop had tried to bribe him with a lifetime supply of pastries if he lowered their rent. But mostly, she observed, trying to find the father she once knew beneath the man he'd become. They stopped again at the fountain. He sat where he always did, near the west edge where the sun hit in the late morning. She sat beside him, letting her hand hover over the rippling water. "You really bought all this?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Not because I wanted to, because I needed to. Some places, some people deserve more than what the world gives them. So I gave what I could." She was quiet a moment. Then she asked the question he'd been waiting for. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He looked down, clasping his hands. "Because I didn't want you to see me like I was. Lost. Holding it together for everyone else. I was a soldier, Maya. I was trained to move forward, even when I was bleeding. But when your mama passed, I didn't move. Not really. I just stopped. I didn't want to drag you into that." Her voice trembled. "I wasn't asking for perfect. I was asking for you." He nodded slowly. "I know that now." And then, quietly, without fuss or fanfare, she reached over and took his hand. He looked up, startled by the touch more than the gesture. "You still wear your wedding band," she said, eyeing the ring on his finger. "I never took it off," he replied. "Not once." Later that afternoon, the mall buzzed with unexpected visitors. Word had spread that the new owner had declined a high-profile tenant, a luxury goods chain known for pushing out small retailers. Instead, he had signed leases with 3 minority-owned startups, a bookstore, a plant shop, and a cafe run by a veteran and his wife. A reporter from the local paper requested an interview. Elijah declined, but when the reporter asked to feature Maya instead as the daughter of the man behind it all, she hesitated, then said yes. Not because she wanted to be seen, but because she wanted people to know what dignity looked like in the quiet. The kind of dignity that didn't shout or demand attention, but changed everything it touched. That evening, Elijah returned to the jewelry store one last time. The new manager greeted him with a respectful nod and invited him behind the counter. "I have something you might want to see," she said, unlocking a drawer. Inside was a small black velvet box. When she opened, a necklace lay coiled inside. Platinum, yes, but different than before. It was designed to resemble a silver tree branch, delicate and strong, with a small teardrop pearl hanging like morning dew. "We had it made. Inspired by the story," the manager said. "It's called The Quiet Route." Elijah blinked, stunned. "It's beautiful," he said. "We're donating half of the proceeds to local housing programs. And we renamed our training program. It's called the Elijah Standard now. About how to serve people, all people, with respect." He said nothing, just nodded. Then gently he turned away and walked out. Outside, Maya was waiting. She didn't say anything either, just smiled. The next day brought something unexpected. A woman maybe in her 60s stood outside the soap shop. She wore a red coat and held a note in her hand. Teresa, the soap shop owner, called Elijah down. "She says she's looking for you," Teresa whispered. Elijah approached cautiously. The woman held out the note. "I was one of the women who laughed at you that day," she said. "At the jewelry store." Elijah froze. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And thank you. My niece works here now. She says you saved her job, that she feels seen for the first time in months." I didn't know who you were. I didn't see you. And now I do." He looked at her not with bitterness, but with the same calm he had always carried. "I appreciate that," he said. "It takes courage to look back and still walk forward." She nodded, pressed the note into his hand, and left. He didn't open it until hours later. Inside it read, "You taught me what grace looks like. Thank you for not becoming like us." That night, Elijah stood at the edge of the mall's rooftop parking garage. From up there, he could see the lights of the city spreading outward like a field of stars. His daughter stood beside him, a coffee in her hand, bundled in a jacket she borrowed from his closet. "Mom would have liked this view," she said. "She would have," he agreed. The wind picked up, rustling the collar of his coat. He pulled it tighter. "You think it's enough?" he asked. "What I've done here?" She didn't answer right away. "It's not about enough," she finally said. "It's about right." "And you did right, Dad." He didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed just a little. Down below, the mall stayed open late for the first time in months. People laughed. Children played near the fountain, and in a small booth near the corner, a barista wrote a new name on the chalkboard. "Tonight's drink special, Elijah's Brew Strong Warm and Always Humble." 1 month later, the mall looked different, but not in the way most people expected. There were no flashy banners, no television cameras, no self-congratulatory billboards with the new owner's face on them. What changed was quieter, more human. The bookstore on the East Wing now had a reading corner for children with free story hours on Saturdays. The cafe near the food court hired 2 single mothers from a shelter nearby and gave them steady hours and benefits. The janitor, Mr. Lionel, who had once been mocked by teenagers, was now listed as head of maintenance with a new uniform, better pay, and a chair with his name on it in the break room. Elijah never made a speech about it. He just walked the floors early in the morning when the tiles still glistened from cleaning and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh paint. He stopped in on tenants, not to check on profits, but to ask how their kids were doing, if the leaks were fixed, if the new lighting made them feel safer. Maya had extended her visit. She was still staying in the spare bedroom of Elijah's modest home, which hadn't changed much since she was little. The walls still held her mother's favorite paintings. The fridge still had the same magnet that read "Small acts change everything." In the evenings, father and daughter sat at the dinner table like it was the most natural thing in the world, trading stories. She told him about her life in San Diego, her part-time job at the nonprofit, her love for writing, and he told her things he had never said out loud about the night. He almost gave up about how some days he still reached for her mother in his sleep, about how proud he was of her even when he didn't know how to show it. One evening, they took a walk down the street hand in hand like they hadn't done since she was a child. The neighbor waved from their porch, surprised to see Elijah smiling. Word had spread, not just about the mall, but about the man behind it, the man who had once been mocked in public, who now quietly changed lives without needing to prove anything. One day, an old employee from the jewelry store came to find him. She was younger than the other 2, who had laughed at him, not directly involved but present that day. She brought a letter in a small envelope and handed it to Elijah with both hands. "Then move me to another branch," she said quietly, "but I never forgot that day. I wanted you to know not everyone there was heartless." He nodded, accepted the envelope, and wished her well. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "I'm sorry for staying silent when I should have spoken. You showed me that silence is not neutral. Thank you for your grace." Elijah folded it and tucked it into the same drawer where he kept his wife's old recipe cards and Maya's first drawing from kindergarten. One Saturday, a man in a dark gray suit came to the mall. He walked the halls slowly like he was measuring it for something. When Elijah approached, he introduced himself as a developer representing a luxury brand with intentions to convert the entire mall into high-end retail space. The man smiled, offered a generous buyout, and placed a thick envelope of paperwork on the table. Elijah didn't open it. He simply asked one question: "Will Mr. Lionel have a job in your plan?" The man blinked, then stammered something about restructuring. Elijah pushed the envelope back toward him. "Then we don't have a deal." The developer left confused, frustrated, but not surprised. Elijah wasn't building a portfolio. He was building a place where dignity lived. One afternoon, Maya walked past the soap shop and saw Teresa hanging a new sign above the doorway. It read, "Teresa's Apothecary Estate, 2023. Maya smiled, then turned to see her father sitting on a bench near the fountain, sipping coffee and watching children throw pennies into the water. She sat beside him. "You look tired," she said. "A good tired," he replied. She looked at him a moment, then leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, this place, it's not just a mall anymore. It's a second chance." He nodded quietly. That was always the point. That weekend, the mall hosted its first community night, a free event with food, music, local vendors, and games for kids. Elijah didn't take the stage, didn't make a speech. He handed out name tags, cleaned up spilled lemonade, and helped a lost child find his mother. At the end of the night, a teenager who had once mocked Mr. Lionel now stood beside him collecting trash bags and stacking chairs. People were changing, not because they were forced, but because they saw someone live the values he spoke. Later that night, as Elijah locked the doors for the evening, he stood for a long time in front of the fountain where it had all begun. The water shimmered under the mall's lights, and the sound of it echoed softly in the still air. Maya came up behind him, slipping her hand into his. "You did," she whispered. "No," he said, "gently, we're doing it. Together." And for the first time in many years, he felt not just pride, not just peace, but a quiet joy, the kind that doesn't fade with time, the kind that grows roots and stays. In the small office upstairs, taped to the wall beside his desk, was a single photo, his wife holding Maya's hand, laughing in the sunlight. Beneath it, a note scribbled by Maya the night she arrived home. "It's never too late to come back to the light." Elijah looked at it each morning before walking the floors. And each morning he whispered, "Thank you for seeing me," even when the world didn't. Of course. Below is part 6 of a story. He was laughed out of the jewelry store, but came back with the deed to the mall, written in continuous prose with no line breaks, no hyphens, and in the same quiet, cinematic, healing tone. The sun was just beginning to rise when Elijah stepped onto the rooftop of the mall alone, wrapped in his old brown coat, coffee in one hand, and a soft breeze lifting the collar, as if the morning itself was pausing to acknowledge him. The city below, still waking up, windows glowing warm in scattered apartment buildings, cars beginning to hum along distant roads, and the first birds calling out into the chilled air. He took a deep breath, not because he was tired, but because for the first time in a very long time he could pause without guilt, his heart steady, not because life had gotten easier, but because it had gotten quieter, more honest. The mall behind him was beginning to stir, janitors arriving, early tenants unlocking gates, preparing ovens, straightening signs, polishing windows, people moving through motions, some heavy, some hopeful, but all real and human, the kind of movement Elijah had come to treasure, not the noise of ambition, but the rhythm of rebuilding. Down below, a boy no older than 10 ran ahead of his mother through the courtyard and skipped past the fountain where Elijah had once sat alone not long ago. Now, surrounded by laughter and purpose, Elijah turned from the rooftop and made his way back down, walking through the familiar halls, past the plant shop that now hosted weekend workshops for children, past the bookstore where a teenager was reading aloud to a small group of younger kids, their voices quiet but full of light, past the soap shop where Teresa was laughing as she showed a customer how to mix oils by hand, and into the quiet atrium where he sat on a bench near the west-facing glass and watched sunlight spill across the tiles. Maya joined him, holding 2 cups of tea wrapped in paper, sleeves her face, calm, her smile effortless. They didn't need to speak anymore, not every day, because some bonds no longer required words. They sat there for a long time, watching life unfold around them, people they once only hoped would feel seen, now fully standing in their own power. An old man in a security jacket held the door open for a woman with a stroller. A teenage boy wiped down the bench beside Elijah, then gave him a nod of thanks. A girl no older than 7 dropped a crumpled dollar into the donation jar beside the bookstore and said, "I want to help the library grow." Elijah looked over at Maya and smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile people give when they win something, but the kind they give when they see something truly bloom. A week later, Maya packed her bag and hugged her father goodbye, not because she was leaving forever, but because she had work to do back home, and she promised to return on her next break. They stood in the doorway of his house, a modest place, still full of her mother's spirit, and she touched the doorframe like it was sacred before stepping outside and waving as she got into the car. Elijah watched her drive off, then closed the door and sat at the kitchen table where for so many nights he had sat in silence, now replaced by memory and Music and new beginnings. He poured himself a cup of coffee and opened a letter sent from the mayor's office, an invitation to attend a recognition ceremony honoring his contribution to the community. He smiled, gently folded the paper, and placed it in a drawer beside his wife's old scarf and Maya's childhood bracelet. He wouldn't go not because he wasn't grateful, but because he didn't need applause to keep going the following weekend. Something small but unforgettable happened. A little boy ran up to Elijah near the fountain, tugged at his coat, and said, "Are you the man who saved this place?" Elijah looked down. The boy held a crayon drawing of the mall, with people smiling, trees blooming, and a golden sun above it. He handed it to Elijah and said, "My teacher said we should draw our favorite hero. I picked you." Elijah took the drawing, folded it carefully, and thanked the boy, who ran off laughing back to his class. Elijah stood still for a moment, breathing in the weight of it, not the praise, but the truth. Someone had seen him not for what he had, but for what he gave, and in that moment, the pain, the rejection,